Defiant, Iran says it's exceeded its uranium enrichment cap. But European signatories to the nuclear deal say Tehran should stick to its commitments. So what incentives are they providing, and can Europe save the agreement? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Nastasya Tay. Iran is fed up with just talking and wants action. That's the Islamic Republic's message to the remaining signatories of the 2015 nuclear deal, particularly the Europeans. Tehran's warning that it's ready to act more decisively on its commitments under the agreement. Iran has already passed the 3.67% uranium enrichment cap set by the pact and could enrich at even higher levels, possibly upping them every 60 days. But the country has said its actions are reversible if the signatories fulfil their obligations, and that it's open to talks. Dorsa Jabari reports from Tehran.
A diplomatic advisor to French President Emmanuel Macron will be making his way to Tehran in the coming days. That's according to Iran's foreign ministry spokesman. Now, this comes just as Iran has announced that it's scaling back its commitment further to the nuclear agreement, and they've given the European signatories another 60 days for them to respond to Iran's concerns. The foreign ministry spokesman Abbas Mousavi has said that the next 60 days will be critical for the European signatories of the nuclear deal to show that they are seriously committed to it. The spokesman also said that Iran is not going to count on anyone or doesn't have any high hopes for any specific country. The spokesman for Iran's Atomic Energy Organization has also announced on Monday that Tehran's enrichment levels have officially gone above 3.67%, which was the agreed level in the nuclear deal, and it's at 4.5% now. Behrouz Kamalvandi also announced on Monday that the third phase of Iran scaling back its commitment will take place in 60 days, and that's likely to include Iran enriching uranium at 20% levels. All this comes as the international community has condemned Iran's decision to reduce its cooperation with the nuclear deal. For now, the next 60 days is being seen as an attempt by the Rouhani government to allow the Europeans to uphold their end of the deal, but the Iranians have said that they will not stay in this deal at any cost. It is up to the EU signatories to try and show that they are committed to this deal by upholding their end of the bargain. Dorsa Jabari for Inside Story.
Well, now let's hear what Iran's foreign ministry spokesman Abbas Mousavi had to say.
We have no hope nor trust in anyone, nor any country, but the door of diplomacy is open. If the remaining countries in the deal, especially the Europeans, do not fulfill their commitment seriously and do not do anything more than talk, Iran's third step will be harder, more steadfast and stunning.
Now, European parties to the 2015 deal have condemned Iran's decision. However, France has said a dispute resolution mechanism that follows any party's breach of the agreement won't be triggered, at least for now. Germany has urged Iran to reverse all activities considered inconsistent with its commitments. So has the UK, which also said that while Iran has broken the terms of the nuclear deal, Britain remained fully committed to it. Well, let's now bring in our guests. In Tehran, we have Mohammad Marandi. He's the Dean of World Studies at the University of Tehran. In London, Ellie Geranmayeh. She's the Deputy Head of the Middle East and North Africa Programme at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And in Vienna, via Skype, Robert Kelly. He's a nuclear engineer who's held top positions at the International Atomic Energy Agency and at the US Department of Energy's Los Alamos National Lab. Welcome to you all. Robert, I'd like to start with you. Explain the situation to all of us who aren't nuclear energy experts. This cap of 3.67%, what does that actually mean, the exceeding of that?
3.67 is a very low level consistent with nuclear power fuel. It has nothing to do with building a bomb. It does indicate that they are capable of enriching uranium to a higher level. Going to 5% is a very small increase. It's well, I would say it's proof that they are not working on a bomb, because going from 3.67 to 5 is only a very minor thing that they're doing. The whole reason that they're doing this is to get the attention of the U.S.
Mohammad Marandi in Tehran, let me ask you, is this all then just a symbolic gesture? What will this potentially enriched uranium be used for? Because Tehran has said that it's going to only enrich what it needs.
The Iranians have, as your audience knows, they've been abiding by the nuclear deal since day one. And ever since the United States last year exited the agreement, the Iranians have been in full compliance as well. So since the Europeans have been basically abiding by Trump's demands, they've not been protecting their businesses, they've not been protecting their businessmen and women, or their banks, or their insurance companies. So therefore, effectively, they are part of the Trump-led sanctions. And that is in complete violation of the deal. So after the Americans left, the Europeans literally begged the Iranians to stay in the deal so that over the next few weeks, the Europeans would work something out. Well, a few weeks became more than a year, nothing happened, and the Iranians said that the only way left for us is to begin decreasing our commitments to the JCPOA, to begin putting pressure on the Europeans to abide by their commitments. So when the Europeans get upset with the Iranians about decreasing their commitments, the Iranians feel that there's a lot of Eurocentric arrogance here, because it's the Iranians who should be complaining about the Europeans. So even now, as the Iranians are step by step moving away from their commitments, and there's still a lot of commitments left, which we can get to later, but they've said that if the Europeans start abiding by the deal, and in other words, ignoring Trump, importing oil, facilitating ordinary trade between the EU and Iran, then the Iranians would reverse all the steps that they've taken over the past few weeks. It's pretty simple, and I think it's quite clear to anyone who looks at the situation objectively that the Iranians have the right to be angry, and that these are the necessary steps that they have to take to get the attention, not of the Americans, but of the Europeans.
Well, given that we're talking about Eurocentric arrogance, let me bring in Ellie. Ellie, on Sunday, we heard Emmanuel Macron, the French president, threaten Tehran, essentially, warning that consequences would necessarily follow now that this cap has been passed. But at the same time, he's also trying to get everyone back to the negotiating table. Is this a change of tone, or is this a carrot and stick kind of situation?
Look, I think the Europeans are trying to tread a very careful balance here about not coming across as naive on the nuclear issue as far as the Trump White House is positioned, but also ensuring that they don't push Iran into an even tighter corner than it already feels under the US sanctions pressure. Now, what we've seen from Iran at the moment is a very managed and calculated escalation on the nuclear file, which from a European side still doesn't seem to have hit their red lines. We're not sure what the red lines are at the moment, but clearly what we've seen is very small incremental exceeding of these nuclear commitments, which again, as your previous guest mentioned, are quite low on the spectrum of nuclear activity and can be reversed and managed if there is enough diplomatic efforts made in the next few weeks and months ahead. What I'm seeing from the European side, particularly the French initiative, is to try and buy some time through a diplomatic pathway with Tehran in the run-up to the UN General Assembly in September, to really try and change the dynamics around the nuclear deal, to stop the escalation, both from the American side on piling on greater sanctions, and from the Iranian side on withdrawing from its compliance. Now, one of the things we might well see from the European side in the summer days is an outreach, an even greater outreach, I should say, to the White House to see if they can create some flexibility and breathing room as far as Iran's oil exports are concerned, which is a really critical issue for Tehran if it is to indeed stay compliant to this deal. The other element where the Europeans are really focused on diplomatically and technically is trying to really launch this mechanism for trade with Iran known as INSTEX, which many had thought would come about by this time. Unfortunately, there has been some problems with it, but we're hoping that this is going to be imminently facilitating certain transactions and trades between European companies and Iranian companies, just to show Iran something tangible is on the table for sticking to this deal.
Indeed, and I want to ask Mohammad and Tehran about that. So this deal, INSTEX, trying to get around US sanctions essentially, is that not enough of a symbol to Tehran that Europe wants to be on board with this deal?
No, it's very little and unacceptable for the Iranians. Instex is an empty vessel. And unless there is money in the system, it's valueless. So in order for trade to take place, the Europeans must allow and protect their companies to do business with Iran. So companies who want to import oil, they have to be protected from the Americans. And the Americans are basically interfering in internal European affairs. They're telling them who you can trade with and who you cannot trade with. So the Europeans, by some calculations, the European economy is larger than that of the American economy, by some calculations. The European population, EU population, is larger than that of the United States. It's ridiculous to believe that the Europeans don't have leverage over the Americans. The Chinese are defying American bullying, and their imports of Iranian oil are on the rise as we speak. The Russians are defying the Americans. The Iranians just simply don't accept the argument that the Europeans can't, and the fact that the Europeans could cooperate with countries like Russia, China, and other major players in the international community. If they did that sort of cooperation, there's very little that the Americans can do. So Instex can only work if European companies are allowed to work in Iran, or if the European governments are too afraid to stand up to the United States and protect their companies, then the European governments have to purchase Iranian oil in the place of their companies. But this alone, this mechanism, is an empty vessel. It doesn't do anything unless there's money flowing through.
Ellie in London, I want to ask you a little more about that. Is there the capacity for European governments to actually extend a hand to help protect companies from US sanctions? And beyond that, is there the space or resources to start purchasing Iranian oil if companies aren't going to do that? Because companies are the ones who are going to have to bear the risk here.
So over the past year, essentially, there was an experiment phase for European governments and their companies to see really what is the impact of US unilateral sanctions on their economy. Now, looking a year on, we see that it is extensive, vast, and probably greater than anyone had predicted a year ago in Europe. We at ECFR have been doing a really extensive study into Europe's capabilities to respond to US secondary sanctions. And unfortunately, the way the economies are intertwined at the moment creates a really easy ability for the US to weaponize its sanctions against European governments and their companies. Now, what we're seeing in Instex is the very first elemental steps towards a longer-term roadmap for response to this economic statecraft that we've seen from the United States. Unfortunately for Iran, right now it doesn't seem that Europe either has the capacity or the political willingness to circumvent or undermine US secondary sanctions. So it's very clear that Instex, at least in this initial phase, is going to be restricted to facilitating humanitarian trade with Iran. It's going to probably get a credit line from certain EU governments, and it's going to only perhaps in a later stage connect to other economies, third countries like, for example, India or Japan or China. But for now, the idea is to keep the ambition small and limited to be able to actually get this mechanism on its legs to prevent it from being shot down on arrival by the White House or the US Treasury, and to create something bigger. And this is the promise that Europe is giving to Iran. Now, the ball is in Tehran's court to decide whether that is enough or not. And I would agree perhaps with your earlier guests that part of what we're seeing from Iran now, a year on of waiting for Europe, is essentially to say that Europe doesn't right now have the capacity to deliver on the economic file. And really the escalation we're seeing on the nuclear issue or other aspects in the region is to try and create leverage for possible negotiations that include directly with the United States.
In that case, let me speak as well to Robert, who's worked within the US government. The terms of this deal, the 2015 deal, seemed pretty clear in terms of preventing the production of a nuclear weapon, but President Trump has said he wants a better deal, and that's what's triggered all of this. In your mind, what would a better deal involve? What kinds of terms could be improved from the 2015 deal?
The people who negotiated the 2015 deal realized they couldn't cover the whole waterfront. They couldn't deal with terrorism and missiles and things like that. They felt that the nuclear explosive was the thing that posed the most threat to the Middle East and to the United States. So they limited it to a fairly small set of things. I think that was a very smart and wise thing they've done. Trump, from time to time, says he thinks it should be missiles, he thinks it should be terrorism. He doesn't understand what was done before. And that's what makes him so dangerous, is he changes his mind every day and doesn't understand what the purpose of this was. A better deal? I think just sticking to this deal would be a good one. Trump's mantra these days is he won't let Iran develop a nuclear weapon. Well, the JCPOA is doing that. It's important, too, I think, to realize that Iran has not withdrawn from the JCPOA. As Mohammad was saying, it's just a matter of they are changing the terms slightly within the JCPOA. They're still there. The IAEA was able to determine the next day that they had started to increase the amount of uranium they were producing. They're detecting now within one day that the enrichment is going up. And it's Iran that's leading the IAEA to these places and saying, you have the right to come here every day. Let us show you where you should be making measurements and see that we're telling the truth. So they're not out of the deal. They're very much in it. It's the U.S. who's out of the deal.
Well, let's go back to Tehran and Mohammad Marandi. I want to ask you a little more about the further enrichment of uranium beyond what we're seeing now. So the threat that in 60 days' time they're going to up these enrichment levels and then potentially continue upping them 60 days beyond that. Where does this all end?
Well, again, it depends on the Europeans, because the Europeans have commitments, and the Iranians are not going to accept any change whatsoever to the JCPOA, because a change in the JCPOA means basically that Iran will be appeasing Trump. And that would lead to a very dangerous situation. Every time Trump wants something from Iran, he'll start threatening the country again. If you wake up in the morning, a new tweet, new sanctions, new demands. So there's no way, the Americans keep talking about, or some Europeans keep talking about a new deal. I assure you, there is no way that that is going to happen. This is all that Iran is going to accept. Many in Iran never accepted the deal. They thought it was a bad deal. There was a huge debate in Iran. Many said that they had given too many concessions, that they were too flexible. But at the end of the day, all sides agreed to the deal. And as your previous guest rightly pointed out, other issues could not be put on the table because the differences were so great. What the Americans consider as terrorism, the Iranians consider as resistance, like when Israel invades Lebanon, Iran's support for the resistance in Lebanon, or Iran's view that the United States and the Saudis have been supporting extremism and terrorism in Syria and starvation in Yemen and so on. The differences were so enormous that the talks would have led to nowhere. So we have an agreement. Both sides gave concessions. Both sides have people who are unhappy about it. But at the end of the day, both sides have committed themselves to it. And again, if Iran were to accept new conditions, that would be going down a very slippery slope towards extreme danger. And therefore, there's no chance for that. So if the Europeans want to save the agreement, they have to take a stand. They are vulnerable to the United States, but the United States is vulnerable. The Iranians simply won't accept that argument. If the Europeans want to be relevant, they have to, or they want to be seen as relevant, they have to be relevant. They can't say we can't do anything, but also want to sit at the negotiating table.
I want to ask Ellie a little more about the US pressure that we're hearing so much about. We also saw British Marines board and seize an Iranian tanker off the coast of Gibraltar on Thursday. Is that an example of Europe giving in to US pressure?
Well, it seems to have sparked a discussion internally within the EU as well in terms of European Union sanctions framework. There is now a spat between the Spanish government and the UK government about authority to carry out this activity. And there is this perception definitely inside Tehran that this operation was conducted at the behest of the White House. Now, it will be interesting to see if Iran indeed actually takes up a legal challenge for the release of tanker and essentially puts a legal challenge onto the UK for this activity, because there's a lot of question marks about whether this activity was actually legal under the EU sanctions framework in itself. But that's a question to be worked out. Certainly what we're seeing now is that the firewall that was put in place between the nuclear deal and other areas of contentions, issues between Iran and Europe for the last 4 years is starting to deteriorate. And the more escalation we're seeing on one area is going to have impact on the nuclear deal and the political relations between the Europeans and the Iranians. I do think it will be important to see if both the UK and Iran in this circumstance can come up with a diplomatic route out of this for cooler heads to prevent this from escalating further, because at the end of the day, the UK is a critical party to this nuclear deal. It's an active shareholder of this INSTEC mechanism, and it could be an important intermediary when it comes to how Iran and the United States liaise going forward, especially once the domestic leadership questions about the premiership in the UK are resolved in the coming weeks.
Well, let me ask Robert a little more about these growing European or UK and US tensions, because the British ambassador to Washington in some leaked comments described US policy on Iran as incoherent, chaotic, says it's unlikely that US policy on Iran is going to become more coherent anytime soon because this is a divided administration. Robert, who's driving the hardline approach within the US administration, and what's the aim of all of this?
Those were really quite amazing comments, weren't they? I think we all enjoyed them, and I think a lot of people saw the truth in it. As Ellie has pointed out, maybe we're going to see a little more in the UK here in a few weeks. Who is driving this? I think the US is speaking with very many voices. It's very hard to tell who the voices are. Some of them are constant, like Bolton and Pompeo, haven't changed their mind. Bolton has a terrible conflict of interest as almost a paid spokesman for MEK in the past. So I don't know why he's even allowed to participate in this. And Trump has his talks in both sides of his mouth all the time. So I don't know how you can say who is speaking there. One thing I do think, though, about this business of the U.S. withdrawing from the deal, it's very odd that the U.S. thinks it's the worst deal ever, but they continue to fund the IAEA's JCPOA activities. And by funding the JCPOA activities, the U.S. is keeping their hand in the game and collecting very valuable intelligence they couldn't get any other way. This is a place where the Europeans could really step up and say, you're not part of this deal anymore. You can leave the deal. Maybe we'll even have to make up the money that you're contributing to JCPOA inspections. But if you're out, you're fully out. And that would be something Europeans could do very legitimately to tell the United States, you're not welcome here.
Well, seeing as the US is keeping its hands in the deal, let me go back to Tehran. And Mohammad, I'm going to give you the final say here. Very briefly, can you tell me, is the Iran nuclear deal now dead, or is there time to save it still?
Well, it's thanks to the Iranians that it's not dead, because after Trump left the deal and the Europeans began violating it, it should have been dead. But the Iranians had patience. They showed strategic patience for 14 months. And now, even as they decrease their commitments, they're doing it in a way to preserve the deal for as long as possible. But there's no doubt that ultimately, if the Europeans do not abide by their commitments, then the Iranians will leave the deal, and they will gradually decrease all their commitments until they reach nothing. And I think the downing of the US drone, a $200 million drone, twice the price of an F-35, by a $20,000 Iranian-made missile is very symbolic, that the Iranians both have the will and the competence to defend themselves. And I think it's very dangerous for the British to carry out such piracy, or the Saudis or the Emiratis to go along with American policy like this. The Iranians have no option but to protect their sovereignty. And if push comes to shove, the Iranians are not going to back down. So it's very dangerous for Washington to play a game of chicken with Iran.
Well, certainly a very dangerous game of chicken, it is indeed. Well, thank you to all our guests, Mohammad Marandi, Ellie Geranmayeh and Robert Kelly. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And do join us for some further discussion. Go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nastasya Tay, and the whole team here, bye for now.